What does the Bible say? The Bible records few details of Jesus' childhood. His birth, Matthew 1-2, Luke 1-2. An episode at age 12, when he is found in the temple arguing with the teachers, Luke 2:41-52. After this, there is complete silence until he appears again at age 30 to be baptized by John the Baptist and begin his public ministry, Luke 3:23. What would have happened during this period? This gap of about 18 years is called the lost years or hidden years of Jesus. The lack of reports has led to many theories, speculations, and oral traditions. The most widely accepted theory among traditional Christian theologians is that Jesus simply lived in Nazareth, working as a carpenter with Joseph, leading an ordinary life as a pious Jew. He would have learned the scriptures, attended the synagogue, and prepared himself spiritually for his mission. And Jesus increased in wisdom and stature, and in favor with God and man. Luke 2:52. But is that really what happened? The silence is deafening. For nearly 2,000 years, one of history's most profound mysteries has been hidden in plain sight, tucked between the pages of the most read book on earth. Tonight, we're about to shatter that silence and uncover truths that have been carefully guarded, deliberately obscured, and systematically erased from the official record. Before we begin this journey together, I need you to understand something crucial. What you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about the most influential figure in human history. It will force you to question not just religious doctrine, but the very foundations of how historical truth is constructed and controlled. This isn't just another biblical study. This is an investigation into forbidden knowledge that powerful institutions have spent centuries trying to suppress. If you're ready to have your worldview fundamentally altered, then hit that like button and subscribe, because we're about to embark on a quest that will take us from the dusty archives of ancient monasteries to the hidden chambers beneath Tibetan temples. We're going to follow a trail of evidence that leads to one inescapable conclusion. The story we've been told is incomplete, and the missing pieces change everything. The question that haunts every serious biblical scholar, every historian who dares to dig deeper, every seeker of truth who refuses to accept simple answers to complex mysteries, is this: where was Jesus of Nazareth for 18 years? 18 years. That's nearly 2 decades of complete silence from the historical record. Think about that for a moment. We're talking about the period between age 12, when Jesus astounded the temple teachers with his wisdom, and age 30, when he suddenly emerged as a fully formed spiritual master ready to transform the world. What happened during those lost years? Where did he go? What did he learn? Who were his teachers? And perhaps most importantly, why has this information been so carefully hidden from us? The official story, the one you learned in Sunday school, the one preached from pulpits across the globe, is remarkably simple. Jesus was a carpenter in Nazareth, quietly working with wood and stone, living an ordinary life until God called him to ministry. Case closed. Nothing to see here. Move along. But here's what they don't tell you. Here's what makes this official narrative fall apart under the slightest scrutiny. When Jesus begins his public ministry at age 30, he doesn't speak like a simple carpenter. He speaks with the authority of someone who has studied the deepest mysteries of existence. He demonstrates knowledge of spiritual practices that were unknown in first-century Palestine. He uses terminology and concepts that don't appear anywhere else in Jewish literature of the time. More mysteriously, when Jesus begins teaching, the people don't just marvel at his words. They're astounded by his wisdom. The Greek word used in the original texts suggests they were shocked, bewildered, unable to comprehend how this man could possess such profound knowledge. This isn't the reaction you get when the local carpenter starts giving spiritual advice. This is the reaction you get when someone returns from years of intensive study with masters who have preserved ancient wisdom. The Gospel of Mark tells us that when Jesus returned to Nazareth and began teaching in the synagogue, the people asked, "Where did this man get this wisdom? What mighty works are wrought by his hands?" They knew him as a carpenter's son, but suddenly he possessed knowledge that surpassed even their most learned rabbis. The question isn't rhetorical. They genuinely didn't know where he had acquired this wisdom. And that's just the beginning of the mystery. Consider the profound philosophical concepts Jesus introduces during his ministry. The idea of the kingdom of heaven as an inner state of consciousness. The teaching that the divine exists within each individual. The emphasis on meditation, contemplation, and direct spiritual experience, rather than mere ritual observance. These concepts were revolutionary in first-century Jewish thought, but they were fundamental principles in the mystery schools of Egypt, the ashrams of India, and the monasteries of Tibet. Where did Jesus learn these ideas? How did a carpenter from a small village in Galilee develop such sophisticated understanding of metaphysical principles that wouldn't appear in mainstream Jewish or Christian thought for centuries? The silence from official sources is telling. The four canonical Gospels, the texts that form the foundation of Christian doctrine, provide virtually no information about Jesus' life between the ages of 12 and 30. It's as if those 18 years simply vanished from the historical record. But absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, especially when that absence is so convenient for maintaining a particular narrative. What we're dealing with here isn't just a gap in the historical record. It's a deliberate erasure, a systematic removal of information that would fundamentally alter our understanding of who Jesus was and what he represented. Because if Jesus spent those missing years studying with masters in distant lands, if he was initiated into ancient wisdom traditions, if he learned practices and teachings that predated Judaism and Christianity by thousands of years, then the entire foundation of orthodox religious doctrine crumbles. The implications are staggering. If Jesus was not just a Jewish Messiah, but a world teacher who had studied the deepest spiritual traditions of multiple cultures, then Christianity becomes not the one true religion, but one expression of universal wisdom. If Jesus learned from Hindu gurus, Buddhist masters, and Egyptian priests, then the exclusive claims of Christian orthodoxy become impossible to maintain. This is why the lost years have been kept lost. This is why the missing pieces of the puzzle have been scattered and hidden. This is why asking these questions has been discouraged, dismissed, and in some cases deemed heretical. But the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it's buried. And tonight, we're going to follow the trail of evidence that leads to a conclusion so revolutionary, so paradigm-shifting, that it will forever change how you understand the most important figure in human history. The first clue comes from an unexpected source. In the high mountains of Tibet, in a monastery that has stood for over 1,000 years, ancient texts speak of a young man from the West who came seeking wisdom. They call him Isa, which is the Tibetan rendering of Jesus. These texts describe his arrival, his studies, his profound spiritual development, and his eventual departure to return to his homeland. But that's not all. Similar accounts exist in India, where Sanskrit texts describe a young Jewish teacher who spent years studying Vedantic philosophy and yogic practices. In Egypt, Coptic manuscripts hint at a mysterious student who delved deep into the mysteries of Isis and Osiris. In Persia, Zoroastrian texts speak of a seeker who learned the ancient teachings about light and darkness, good and evil. These aren't modern fabrications or wishful thinking. These are ancient documents, written centuries ago, preserved in libraries and monasteries across the world. They tell a consistent story. Jesus of Nazareth spent his missing years as a student of the world's greatest spiritual traditions. The evidence goes beyond ancient texts. When we examine Jesus' teachings with fresh eyes, when we strip away 2,000 years of theological interpretation and look at his actual words and methods, we find remarkable parallels to Eastern spiritual practices. His emphasis on meditation, his use of parables that mirror Buddhist and Hindu teaching stories, his focus on compassion and nonviolence, his understanding of karma and rebirth, all point to a teacher who had been exposed to wisdom traditions far beyond the boundaries of first-century Palestine. Even more intriguing are the gaps in the gospel narratives themselves. The writers of the New Testament clearly knew more about Jesus' background than they recorded. There are hints, references, suggestions of experiences and knowledge that came from somewhere else. When Jesus speaks of having seen Abraham, when he claims to have existed before the foundation of the world, when he demonstrates powers and wisdom that seem to come from beyond ordinary human experience, we're getting glimpses of a much larger story. The Gospel of John, in particular, contains passages that read like the testimony of someone who had been initiated into mystery traditions. The opening words about the Logos, the divine word that was with God and was God, echo concepts from Egyptian and Greek mystery schools. The emphasis on gnosis, direct spiritual knowledge, reflects teachings that were central to esoteric traditions throughout the ancient world. But perhaps the most compelling evidence comes from what Jesus didn't say. Despite being raised in a culture obsessed with ritual purity, dietary laws, and temple sacrifice, Jesus consistently taught that the kingdom of God was within, that true worship was a matter of the heart, that love and compassion were more important than religious observance. This wasn't just Reform Judaism. This was a fundamental rejection of the entire sacrificial system that formed the foundation of Jewish religious life. Where did this radical perspective come from? How did a young man raised in Orthodox Jewish tradition develop such a revolutionary understanding of spirituality? The answer becomes clear when we consider that he might have spent years studying with teachers who had preserved much older wisdom, traditions that understood the divine as an inner reality rather than an external deity demanding appeasement. The mystery deepens when we consider the political implications of Jesus' teachings. His message of universal love, his rejection of ethnic and religious boundaries, his emphasis on direct spiritual experience rather than mediated religious authority, all threaten the established order in ways that go far beyond simple religious reform. This was someone who had seen how different cultures approached the divine, who had learned that truth was not the exclusive property of any single tradition. The authorities of his time recognized this threat. They didn't crucify him just for claiming to be the Messiah. They killed him because he represented a fundamental challenge to the entire system of religious and political control. He was dangerous not just to Jewish authority, but to the Roman Empire itself, because he offered people a path to spiritual freedom that bypassed all institutional mediation. This is why the story of the lost years has been suppressed. It's not just about maintaining religious orthodoxy. It's about preserving systems of control that depend on people believing that spiritual truth can only be accessed through approved channels, that salvation can only come through specific institutions, that wisdom is the exclusive property of particular traditions. But the truth is more beautiful and more threatening than any institution can contain. The truth is that Jesus was not just a Jewish Messiah, but a world teacher who had drunk deeply from the wells of human wisdom. He had learned from Hindu sages about the divine nature of consciousness. He had studied with Buddhist masters about the path beyond suffering. He had been initiated into Egyptian mysteries about death and resurrection. He had absorbed Persian teachings about the cosmic battle between light and darkness. When he returned to Palestine, he brought with him not just local religious reform, but a synthesis of the world's greatest spiritual insights. He was offering humanity not just salvation from sin, but liberation from the very illusions that create suffering. He was teaching not just personal redemption, but cosmic transformation. The lost years weren't lost at all. They were the foundation of everything that followed. They were the secret source of the wisdom that would eventually transform the world. And the fact that this information has been hidden tells us everything we need to know about how dangerous truth can be to those who profit from ignorance. As we continue this investigation, we'll follow the trail of evidence across continents and centuries. We'll examine ancient texts that have been dismissed by mainstream scholarship. We'll explore archaeological discoveries that challenge official narratives. We'll piece together clues that have been scattered across the globe, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone brave enough to ask the right questions. The journey we're about to take will lead us through the mystery schools of Egypt, where young initiates learn the secrets of death and rebirth. We'll travel to the ashrams of India, where seekers discovered the divine nature of consciousness. We'll climb to the monasteries of Tibet, where ancient wisdom was preserved through centuries of persecution. We'll explore the connections between Jesus' teachings and the spiritual traditions that preceded and influenced him. But we're not just reconstructing ancient history. We're uncovering truths that are desperately relevant to our modern world. Because if Jesus was indeed a world teacher who had studied the great wisdom traditions, then his message becomes not the exclusive property of Christianity, but the common heritage of all humanity. His teachings become not sectarian doctrine, but universal wisdom. His example becomes not religious dogma, but a blueprint for spiritual evolution. The implications are revolutionary. If Jesus learned from multiple traditions, then perhaps the path to spiritual truth isn't through any single religion, but through the synthesis of humanity's greatest insights. If he was initiated into ancient mysteries, then perhaps the deepest truths about existence have been preserved not in official doctrines, but in hidden teachings that connect all authentic spiritual traditions. This is why the lost years matter. This is why the missing pieces of the puzzle are so crucial. This is why we must have the courage to question official narratives and seek the truth wherever it leads us, no matter how uncomfortable that truth might be for established institutions. The young man who left Palestine at age 12 was not the same person who returned at age 30. Somewhere in those 18 missing years, a transformation occurred that would change the course of human history. Tonight, we begin the journey to discover what really happened during those lost years, and why that discovery changes everything we thought we knew about the most influential figure who ever lived. The mystery is about to be unveiled. The hidden truth is about to be revealed. The lost years are about to be found, and once you see the evidence we're about to present, you'll never look at the story of Jesus the same way again. The establishment doesn't want you to know what we're about to reveal. For nearly 2 millennia, a conspiracy of silence has surrounded the most transformative period in human history. But tonight, that silence ends. Deep within the archives of the Vatican, locked away from public scrutiny, lie documents that tell a very different story about Jesus of Nazareth. Documents that describe his journeys to distant lands, his studies with mysterious teachers, his initiation into secrets that would shake the very foundations of organized religion. These aren't the fantasies of modern conspiracy theorists. These are ancient testimonies, carefully preserved and deliberately hidden, that paint a picture so revolutionary, it threatens everything we've been taught to believe. The first breakthrough came in 1887, when a Russian journalist named Nicholas Notovich was recovering from a broken leg in a Tibetan monastery. During his convalescence, the monks shared with him ancient texts that spoke of Saint Isa, a young man from the West who had arrived in the Himalayas seeking wisdom. As Notovich listened to these accounts, he realized he was hearing the lost story of Jesus' missing years. The Tibetan texts described how Isa had traveled the Silk Road, studying with Buddhist masters, learning meditation techniques that would later appear in his teachings about the kingdom of heaven. They spoke of his profound understanding of karma and rebirth, concepts that were completely foreign to Jewish thought but central to his message about eternal life. They described his mastery of healing arts that combined physical technique with spiritual power. But the Buddhist connection is just the beginning. Evidence suggests that Jesus' spiritual education was far more comprehensive than even the Tibetan texts reveal. Ancient trade routes connected Palestine to the great centers of learning throughout the known world. Young Jewish men were known to travel these routes, seeking wisdom from the masters who preserved humanity's oldest spiritual traditions. Consider the Essenes, the mysterious Jewish sect that flourished in the desert communities around the Dead Sea. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947, they revealed a group whose teachings bore striking similarities to Jesus' later message. The Essenes practiced communal living, emphasized love and compassion over ritual observance, and believed in the imminent transformation of the world. They spoke of a teacher of righteousness who would come to establish God's kingdom on earth. But here's what makes this connection explosive. The Essenes weren't just another Jewish sect. They were the guardians of ancient wisdom that traced back to Egypt, Babylon, and beyond. They preserved teachings about the divine nature of human consciousness, about the possibility of direct communion with God, about the transformation of ordinary reality through spiritual practice. These weren't Jewish innovations. These were universal principles that had been taught in mystery schools for thousands of years. The evidence suggests that Jesus didn't just encounter the Essenes casually. He may have been raised among them, trained by them, initiated into their deepest secrets. This would explain his radical departure from mainstream Jewish teaching, his emphasis on inner transformation rather than external observance, his understanding of spiritual principles that wouldn't appear in Orthodox Judaism for centuries. But the Essene connection leads us to an even more startling possibility. The Essenes maintained contact with mystery schools throughout the ancient world. They were part of a network of spiritual adepts who preserved and transmitted sacred knowledge across cultures and centuries. If Jesus was indeed connected to this network, then his missing years become a journey of initiation that took him to the very source of human wisdom. The trail leads first to Egypt, where the mystery schools of Memphis and Heliopolis had preserved the ancient teachings of Thoth and Hermes. For thousands of years, these schools had taught that the divine spark existed within every human being, that consciousness itself was the fundamental reality, that death was merely a transition to a higher form of existence. These weren't just philosophical concepts. They were practical teachings backed by techniques of meditation, visualization, and spiritual discipline that could transform ordinary awareness into divine consciousness. Egyptian texts speak of foreign students who came to study in these schools, young men from distant lands who sought initiation into the mysteries of death and rebirth. They describe rituals in the Great Pyramid, where initiates would undergo symbolic death and resurrection, emerging with direct knowledge of the spiritual realms. They speak of teachings about the Word, the divine creative principle that brought all existence into being. When Jesus later spoke of being born again, when he described the kingdom of heaven as a state of consciousness, when he demonstrated power over death itself, he was drawing on knowledge that had been preserved in these Egyptian mystery schools for millennia. His teachings weren't revolutionary departures from existing wisdom. They were fresh expressions of humanity's oldest spiritual insights. The Egyptian connection becomes even more intriguing when we consider the Holy Family's flight to Egypt during Jesus' infancy. The Gospel of Matthew tells us that Joseph, Mary, and the infant Jesus fled to Egypt to escape Herod's massacre of the innocents. But the text provides no details about their time there, no information about where they went or whom they encountered. It simply states that they remained in Egypt until Herod's death. What if this wasn't just a period of hiding? What if the Holy Family was connected to the Egyptian mystery schools from the very beginning? What if Jesus' later return to Egypt during his missing years was actually a homecoming, a return to spiritual communities that had sheltered and perhaps begun to train him from his earliest years? The possibility becomes even more compelling when we consider the parallels between Jesus' teachings and the ancient Egyptian concept of ma'at, the principle of divine order and cosmic balance. The Egyptian texts speak of the heart being weighed against the feather of truth, of the soul's journey through various stages of purification, of the ultimate union with the divine source. These concepts appear throughout Jesus' parables and teachings, often in forms that were completely foreign to Jewish thought but perfectly aligned with Egyptian wisdom. But Egypt was just one stop on what appears to have been an extensive spiritual journey. The evidence suggests that Jesus' quest for wisdom took him far beyond the familiar boundaries of the Mediterranean world. Ancient trade routes connected Egypt to India, and along these routes traveled not just merchants and goods, but ideas, teachings, and spiritual practices that would profoundly influence the development of world religions. The Indian connection is perhaps the most controversial aspect of Jesus' missing years, but it's also the most well-documented. Sanskrit texts from Kashmir speak of a young man named Isa, who arrived in the Himalayas during the reign of King Shalivahana. These texts describe his profound understanding of Vedantic philosophy, his mastery of yogic practices, his ability to heal through spiritual power. The Bhavishya Purana, an ancient Hindu text, contains a detailed account of Isa's time in India. It describes how he studied with Brahmin priests, learned the sacred mantras, and developed the ability to enter deep states of meditation. It speaks of his compassionate nature, his concern for the poor and oppressed, his teaching that all beings possess the divine spark within them. What makes these accounts particularly compelling is their consistency with Jesus' later teachings. The Hindu concept of the Atman, the divine self that exists within every individual, corresponds exactly to Jesus' teaching that the kingdom of heaven is within. The Buddhist understanding of compassion as the highest virtue aligns perfectly with Jesus' emphasis on love as the greatest commandment. The yogic practices of meditation and breath control echo the contemplative methods that Jesus would later teach his disciples. But perhaps the most significant connection lies in the shared understanding of consciousness as the fundamental reality. Both Hindu and Buddhist traditions teach that ordinary perception is illusory, that the material world is Maya, a projection of consciousness rather than ultimate reality. Jesus' teaching that my kingdom is not of this world reflects this same insight, suggesting that he had indeed absorbed the deepest wisdom of Eastern philosophy. The evidence for Jesus' time in India extends beyond ancient texts. The Hemis Monastery in Ladakh claims to possess manuscripts that describe Isa's 14-year stay in the region. These documents speak of his studies with Buddhist masters, his travels throughout the Himalayas, his growing reputation as a teacher and healer. They describe his eventual departure, his promise to return, and his impact on the spiritual development of the region. Archaeological evidence supports these claims. Buddhist sculptures from the Gandhara region, dating to the early centuries of the Common Era, show clear Greek and Middle Eastern influences. Trade goods from the Mediterranean world have been found in Indian archaeological sites, demonstrating the extensive cultural exchange that occurred along the Silk Road. The infrastructure for such a journey existed, and the motivation for undertaking it would have been overwhelming for someone seeking the deepest spiritual wisdom. The transformation that such a journey would have produced becomes clear when we examine Jesus' teaching methods. His use of parables mirrors the traditional Buddhist approach of using stories to convey profound truths. His emphasis on direct experience rather than intellectual understanding reflects the yogic principle that wisdom must be embodied, not merely comprehended. His ability to heal through spiritual power corresponds to the siddhis, or spiritual powers, that were considered natural developments along the path of yogic mastery. Even more telling is Jesus' understanding of karma and rebirth, concepts that were completely foreign to Jewish thought, but central to Indian philosophy. When Jesus spoke of actions having consequences that extended beyond this life, when he described the soul's journey through multiple existences, when he taught that spiritual development required many lifetimes of practice, he was drawing on knowledge that could only have come from extensive study of Eastern wisdom traditions. The implications of this Indian connection are staggering. If Jesus had indeed spent years studying with Hindu gurus and Buddhist masters, then his message becomes not the exclusive revelation of Jewish monotheism, but the synthesis of humanity's greatest spiritual insights. His teachings become not sectarian doctrine, but universal wisdom, not religious dogma, but practical guidance for spiritual evolution. This synthesis explains the revolutionary nature of Jesus' message. He wasn't just reforming Judaism. He was offering humanity a path that transcended religious boundaries, that drew on the deepest wisdom of multiple traditions, that pointed toward a universal spirituality that could unite rather than divide the human family. But the journey of discovery didn't end in India. The evidence suggests that Jesus' spiritual education continued as he made his way back toward Palestine, stopping at centers of learning throughout the ancient world. Persian texts speak of a young teacher who studied Zoroastrian principles of light and darkness, good and evil. Greek manuscripts hint at a mysterious student who delved into the philosophical schools of Alexandria. Arabic sources describe a seeker who learned the ancient arts of healing and spiritual transformation. Each of these encounters left its mark on Jesus' eventual teaching. The Zoroastrian understanding of cosmic dualism appears in his parables about wheat and tares, sheep and goats, the narrow and broad paths. The Greek philosophical emphasis on the logos, the divine word, echoes throughout the Gospel of John. The Arabic wisdom traditions of sacred geometry and mystical mathematics surface in his teaching about the measurements of the spiritual temple. By the time Jesus returned to Palestine at age 30, he had been transformed from a simple village carpenter into a world teacher who had drunk deeply from the wells of human wisdom. He had learned from the masters who preserved humanity's oldest spiritual traditions. He had been initiated into mysteries that connected him to the divine source of all existence. He had developed powers and insights that would enable him to transform not just individual lives, but the entire course of human history. The evidence for this transformation is overwhelming once you know what to look for. Jesus' teachings contain elements that can't be explained by his Jewish background alone. His methods reflect practices that were unknown in first-century Palestine, but well established in the mystery schools of Egypt and the ashrams of India. His understanding of consciousness, healing, and spiritual development demonstrates knowledge that could only have come from years of intensive study with the world's greatest spiritual masters. But perhaps the most compelling evidence lies in the reaction of his contemporaries. When Jesus began teaching, people didn't just admire his wisdom, they were astounded by it. They couldn't understand how someone they had known as a simple carpenter could suddenly demonstrate such profound knowledge of spiritual truth. The only explanation that makes sense is that he had undergone a transformation during his missing years that prepared him for his cosmic mission. The authorities recognized the threat immediately. Jesus wasn't just challenging Jewish religious law. He was offering people direct access to spiritual truth that bypassed all institutional mediation. He was teaching techniques and principles that would make organized religion obsolete. He was revealing secrets that the mystery schools had guarded for centuries, making them available to anyone who had ears to hear. This is why they killed him. Not just because he claimed to be the Messiah, but because he represented a fundamental threat to every system of spiritual control. He was dangerous not just to Jewish authority, but to the entire structure of religious and political power that depended on people believing that salvation could only come through approved channels. The crucifixion was meant to end the threat. But death couldn't contain the truth that Jesus had learned during his missing years. The resurrection, whether understood literally or symbolically, represents the triumph of the wisdom he had acquired over the forces that sought to suppress it. The spiritual knowledge he had gained from the world's greatest teachers couldn't be killed. It could only be transformed and transmitted to future generations. This is why the story of the lost years has been so carefully hidden. It's not just about maintaining Christian orthodoxy. It's about preserving systems of control that depend on people believing that spiritual truth is the exclusive property of particular institutions. The revelation that Jesus had studied with multiple wisdom traditions threatens the entire foundation of religious exclusivity. But the truth is more beautiful and more liberating than any institution can contain. The truth is that Jesus was not just a Jewish Messiah, but a world teacher who had synthesized the greatest spiritual insights of human civilization. His message was not sectarian doctrine, but universal wisdom. His example was not religious dogma, but a blueprint for spiritual evolution that transcends all cultural and religious boundaries. The lost years weren't lost at all. They were the foundation of everything that followed. They were the secret source of the wisdom that would eventually transform the world. And the fact that this information has been hidden tells us everything we need to know about how dangerous truth can be to those who profit from spiritual ignorance. As we continue this investigation, we'll uncover evidence that will shatter every assumption you've ever held about the origins of Christianity. We'll explore connections that have been deliberately obscured, reveal documents that have been systematically suppressed, and piece together the true story of humanity's greatest spiritual teacher. The journey we're about to take will challenge everything you thought you knew about religion, spirituality, and the nature of truth itself. Because the real story of Jesus' missing years isn't just ancient history. It's the key to understanding the spiritual destiny of humanity and the path to a wisdom that transcends all boundaries. The mystery is about to be unveiled. The hidden truth is about to be revealed. And once you see the evidence we're about to present, you'll understand why the lost years of Jesus are the most important secret in human history. But the evidence doesn't stop there. In fact, what we're about to reveal will shake you to your very core. Hidden within the walls of monasteries scattered across the Himalayas, preserved in languages that few Western scholars have ever bothered to learn, lie testimonies that read like the missing chapters of the greatest story ever told. The monks of Hemis Monastery in Ladakh have guarded these secrets for over 1,000 years. When Nicholas Notovich first encountered these texts in 1887, he was told that they contained the true account of Saint Isa's time among them. But what Notovich published was just a fraction of what these ancient documents actually reveal. The full manuscripts, written on palm leaves and preserved in cedar boxes, tell a story so extraordinary that it would fundamentally alter every Christian's understanding of their faith. According to these texts, the young man known as Isa didn't just visit the monastery. He spent years there, mastering techniques of meditation that would later form the foundation of his most profound teachings. The manuscripts describe how he would sit in caves for days at a time, learning to access states of consciousness that the Buddhist masters called enlightenment. They speak of his growing ability to heal through touch, to perceive the thoughts of others, to demonstrate powers that seem to transcend the natural world. But here's where the story becomes truly revolutionary. The Tibetan texts don't just describe Jesus as a student. They describe him as a master who eventually surpassed his teachers. They speak of his unique ability to synthesize the wisdom of different traditions, to find the common thread that connected all authentic spiritual paths. They describe him as someone who was preparing for a mission that would transform the spiritual landscape of the entire world. The implications are staggering. If these accounts are accurate, then Jesus didn't just happen to stumble upon profound spiritual truths. He was systematically trained by the greatest masters of his time, initiated into secrets that had been preserved for millennia, prepared for a role that would require him to bridge the gap between Eastern and Western spirituality. This training becomes evident when we examine the specific techniques Jesus later taught his disciples. His instructions about meditation, about visualization, about the power of concentrated intention, all reflect practices that were well established in the monasteries of Tibet and India. His understanding of energy healing, his ability to perceive the spiritual dimensions of physical ailments, his mastery of what we might today call psychic phenomena, all point to someone who had undergone intensive training in the esoteric arts. The Gospel accounts themselves provide tantalizing hints of this hidden knowledge. When Jesus spoke of having other sheep that were not of this fold, was he referring to the spiritual communities he had encountered during his missing years? When he demonstrated his transfiguration on the mountain, showing his disciples his light body, was he displaying techniques he had learned from Tibetan masters? When he spoke of the many mansions in his Father's house, was he describing the multiple levels of reality that Eastern wisdom traditions had mapped for thousands of years? The evidence becomes even more compelling when we consider the reaction of Jesus' disciples to his teachings. These were simple fishermen and tax collectors, yet they were able to perform miracles, to heal the sick, to demonstrate spiritual powers that seemed impossible. How did they acquire these abilities so quickly? The answer becomes clear when we understand that Jesus was teaching them techniques he had spent years perfecting under the guidance of the world's greatest spiritual masters. But the Tibetan connection is just one thread in a tapestry of evidence that spans continents and cultures. As we trace Jesus' journey backward from his return to Palestine, we discover that his spiritual education was far more comprehensive than even the most radical scholars have dared to suggest. The route from Tibet to Palestine passed through Kashmir, a region that has always been a crossroads of spiritual traditions. Local legends speak of a young teacher who spent time in the valley, studying with Hindu pandits and Sufi masters. The shrines and temples of Kashmir contain inscriptions that some scholars believe refer to Jesus, though these claims have been systematically suppressed by both Christian and Islamic authorities. But it's not just the legends that point to Jesus' presence in Kashmir. The very structure of his later teachings reflects the unique synthesis of Hindu, Buddhist, and Sufi wisdom that characterized Kashmir's spiritual tradition. His emphasis on love as the highest spiritual principle echoes the Sufi understanding of divine love as the path to union with God. His teaching about the kingdom of heaven as an inner state reflects the Hindu concept of the Atman, the divine self that exists within every being. His use of paradox and mystery in his parables mirrors the Buddhist understanding that ultimate truth transcends rational comprehension. The journey from Kashmir would have taken Jesus through the great centers of learning that flourished along the Silk Road. The city of Taxila, in what is now Pakistan, was renowned throughout the ancient world for its universities and libraries. Greek, Persian, Indian, and Chinese scholars gathered there to exchange knowledge and debate philosophy. If Jesus had indeed traveled this route, he would have encountered intellectual traditions that spanned the known world. The evidence for Jesus' presence in this region comes from unexpected sources. Local folklore preserves stories of a young teacher who challenged the established religious authorities, who spoke of a universal God that transcended all cultural and religious boundaries, who demonstrated healing powers that amazed even the most skeptical observers. These stories, passed down through generations of oral tradition, contain details that remarkably parallel the gospel accounts of Jesus' ministry. But perhaps the most intriguing evidence comes from the linguistic analysis of Jesus' teachings. Many of the concepts he expressed using Aramaic and Greek terminology actually have their roots in Sanskrit and other Eastern languages. The very structure of his thought, the way he approached spiritual questions, the metaphors he used to describe transcendent realities, all reflect patterns of thinking that were characteristic of Eastern philosophy, rather than Semitic thought. This linguistic evidence becomes particularly compelling when we consider the precision with which Jesus used certain terms. His description of the word, the logos, as the creative principle of existence, corresponds exactly to the Sanskrit concept of the primordial sound that brought the universe into being. His teaching about the light that was the life of men reflects the Vedantic understanding of consciousness as the fundamental reality from which all existence emerges. The synthesis of traditions that Jesus represented becomes even more apparent when we examine his healing methods. The Gospel accounts describe him using techniques that were unknown in Jewish medical practice, but well established in the healing traditions of India and Tibet. His use of touch, his ability to perceive the spiritual causes of physical ailments, his understanding of the connection between consciousness and health, all point to someone who had been trained in the esoteric healing arts. But the most revolutionary aspect of Jesus' message wasn't just his individual teachings. It was his vision of a universal spirituality that could unite humanity across all cultural and religious boundaries. This wasn't a Jewish concept. It wasn't a Greek or Roman idea. It was a synthesis of wisdom traditions that could only have emerged from someone who had studied with masters from multiple cultures. The early Christian communities understood this universal dimension of Jesus' message. The Acts of the Apostles describes how the gospel spread rapidly throughout the ancient world, finding acceptance among peoples of widely different cultural backgrounds. This wasn't just the result of effective missionary work. It was because Jesus' teachings contained elements that resonated with the spiritual traditions of every culture they encountered. The Greek philosophers found in Jesus' teachings echoes of their own understanding of the Logos. The Persian Magi recognized concepts that aligned with their Zoroastrian beliefs about light and darkness. The Egyptian mystery schools saw in his message reflections of their own teachings about death and resurrection. The Indian sages heard in his words the same truths they had been teaching for centuries about the divine nature of consciousness. This universal appeal of Jesus' message wasn't accidental. It was the result of his systematic study of the world's greatest spiritual traditions during his missing years. He had learned to speak the spiritual language of every culture, to find the common thread that connected all authentic paths to the divine. But this universal understanding of Jesus' message posed a threat to the emerging institutional church. As Christianity became more organized, more hierarchical, more concerned with maintaining doctrinal purity, the emphasis shifted from the universal wisdom Jesus had taught to the exclusive claims of Christian orthodoxy. The fact that Jesus had studied with non-Christian teachers, that his message contained elements from multiple traditions, that his vision was inclusive rather than exclusive, all had to be suppressed. The process of suppression began early. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE established the official Christian doctrine, but it also systematically excluded texts and teachings that didn't conform to the approved narrative. The Gnostic Gospels, which contained more explicit references to Jesus' esoteric knowledge, were declared heretical and destroyed. The mystical traditions within Christianity, which preserved some of the techniques Jesus had learned during his missing years, were marginalized and eventually driven underground. The suppression continued through the centuries. The Inquisition targeted anyone who suggested that spiritual truth could be found outside the approved channels of the Church. The Crusades were fought partly to prevent Christian contact with the Islamic and Eastern traditions that preserved alternative accounts of Jesus' life. The colonial expansion of Christian Europe systematically destroyed the libraries and monasteries that contained evidence of Jesus' missing years. But the truth has a way of surviving, even under the most intense persecution. Hidden in remote monasteries, preserved in languages that few outsiders could read, protected by communities that understood the revolutionary nature of what they guarded, the evidence of Jesus' true spiritual education has endured. The rediscovery of this evidence in the modern era has been met with fierce resistance from established religious institutions. When scholars have attempted to publish their findings, they've faced ridicule, ostracism, and in some cases, threats to their careers and personal safety. The academic establishment, heavily influenced by Christian institutions, has systematically ignored or dismissed evidence that challenges orthodox narratives. But the evidence keeps mounting. Archaeological discoveries in India and Tibet continue to uncover artifacts that support the accounts of Jesus' presence in these regions. Linguistic analysis reveals deeper connections between Jesus' teachings and Eastern philosophy. Comparative religious studies demonstrate the remarkable parallels between Christian mysticism and the traditions of the East. The implications of this evidence extend far beyond academic curiosity. If Jesus was indeed a world teacher who had studied with masters from multiple traditions, then the entire foundation of religious exclusivity crumbles. Christianity becomes not the one true faith, but one expression of universal wisdom. The path to salvation becomes not membership in a particular church, but the sincere pursuit of spiritual truth wherever it may be found. This understanding doesn't diminish Jesus' significance. If anything, it enhances it. Instead of being the founder of just another religion, he becomes the great synthesizer who brought together the wisdom of all traditions. Instead of being the exclusive savior of a chosen people, he becomes the universal teacher whose message transcends all cultural and religious boundaries. The resistance to this understanding comes from those who have built their power on the foundation of religious exclusivity. The revelation that Jesus had studied with non-Christian teachers threatens the entire structure of institutional authority that depends on people believing that spiritual truth can only be accessed through approved channels. But the truth is more beautiful and more liberating than any institution can contain. The truth is that Jesus was not just a Jewish Messiah, but a world teacher who had absorbed the greatest spiritual insights of human civilization. His message was not sectarian doctrine, but universal wisdom. His example was not religious dogma, but a blueprint for spiritual evolution that transcends all boundaries. The lost years weren't lost at all. They were the foundation of everything that followed. They were the secret source of the wisdom that would eventually transform the world. And the fact that this information has been hidden tells us everything we need to know about how dangerous truth can be to those who profit from spiritual ignorance. As we continue to uncover this evidence, we begin to see the true scope of the cover-up. This isn't just about hiding a few embarrassing details from Jesus' biography. This is about suppressing a vision of spirituality that could unite humanity, heal the divisions between religions, and point the way toward a future where spiritual truth becomes the common heritage of all people. The stakes couldn't be higher. The revelation of Jesus' true spiritual education has the power to transform not just individual understanding, but the entire landscape of human spirituality. It offers hope for a world torn apart by religious conflict, a path toward unity based on shared wisdom rather than exclusive claims to truth. But to understand the full implications of this revelation, we must continue our investigation. We must follow the evidence wherever it leads, no matter how uncomfortable it might be for established institutions. We must have the courage to question everything we've been taught and seek the truth that lies hidden beneath layers of dogma and institutional control. The journey we're taking together isn't just about uncovering historical facts. It's about discovering a vision of spirituality that could transform the world. It's about finding the path that Jesus himself walked during his missing years, a path that led him to become not just a religious leader, but a spiritual revolutionary, whose true message has been hidden for nearly 2,000 years. The mystery is deeper than we ever imagined. The cover-up is more extensive than we ever realized. The truth is more revolutionary than we ever dared to hope. And the time has come to reveal it all, regardless of the consequences. The lost years of Jesus are about to be lost no more. The hidden truth is about to be revealed. And once you see what we're about to show you, you'll understand why this information has been suppressed for so long, and why its revelation changes everything about how we understand spirituality, religion, and the destiny of humanity itself. The evidence is overwhelming. The implications are staggering. The time for silence is over. The truth about Jesus' missing years is about to shake the foundations of everything you thought you knew about the most important figure in human history. Are you ready for the revelation that will change everything? Are you prepared to see evidence that challenges every assumption you've ever held about religion and spirituality? Are you willing to follow the truth wherever it leads, no matter how uncomfortable it might be? Because what we're about to reveal will not just change your understanding of Jesus, it will transform your entire worldview about the nature of spiritual truth, the purpose of religion, and the destiny of humanity itself. The lost years are about to be found, and with them, the key to understanding the greatest mystery in human history. The cover-up is about to be exposed. The truth is about to be revealed. And nothing will ever be the same again. The trail of evidence we've been following leads us to a revelation so profound, so carefully concealed, that it threatens to unravel the very fabric of Orthodox Christianity. But before we can fully grasp the magnitude of what we're about to uncover, we need to understand the sophisticated network of suppression that has kept this information hidden for nearly 2 millennia. What we're dealing with isn't just passive neglect or accidental loss of historical records. This is active, systematic erasure orchestrated by the highest levels of religious and political authority. The evidence points to a conspiracy that began in the earliest days of the Christian Church and continues to this day. A deliberate campaign to bury the truth about Jesus' missing years and the revolutionary implications of his true spiritual education. The first layer of this cover-up becomes apparent when we examine the canonization process itself. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE wasn't just about establishing Christian doctrine. It was about creating a sanitized version of Jesus' story that would serve the political needs of the Roman Empire. Emperor Constantine needed a religion that would unify his diverse territories under a single spiritual authority. The universal wisdom that Jesus had actually taught, the synthesis of traditions that threatened all exclusive claims to truth, had to be eliminated. The bishops who gathered at Nicaea had access to far more information about Jesus' life than what eventually made it into the canonical Gospels. They possessed texts that described his travels, his teachers, his systematic education in the mystery traditions of the ancient world. But these documents were deemed dangerous to the new imperial Christianity. They were collected, catalogued, and either destroyed or hidden away in the deepest vaults of the emerging church hierarchy. The process of suppression was methodical and ruthless. The Gnostic Gospels, which contained more explicit references to Jesus' esoteric knowledge and his connections to Eastern wisdom traditions, were declared heretical. Their possession became punishable by death. The libraries of Alexandria, which contained irreplaceable records of Jesus' time in Egypt, were systematically destroyed. The monasteries of the East, which preserved accounts of his studies with Buddhist and Hindu masters, were cut off from communication with the Western Church. But the most devastating blow to the historical record came with the rise of Islamic power in the 7th century. As Muslim armies swept across the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia, they encountered Christian communities that had preserved very different accounts of Jesus' life. These Eastern Christians, who had never been fully integrated into the Roman Church, possessed traditions that spoke openly of Jesus' travels to India, his studies with Sufi masters, his initiation into the mysteries of ancient Persia. The Islamic conquest presented both an opportunity and a threat. On one hand, Muslim scholars were fascinated by these alternative accounts of Jesus, whom they revered as a great prophet. Many of these stories were incorporated into Islamic tradition, where they were preserved with greater fidelity than in Christian sources. On the other hand, the disruption of Christian communities in these regions meant that many manuscripts were lost, scattered, or hidden away for protection. What survived this period of upheaval was often deliberately obscured. The Islamic scholars who preserved these accounts used coded language, symbolic references, and metaphorical descriptions that would protect the information from those who might seek to destroy it. The stories of Jesus' travels were woven into the fabric of Sufi teaching tales, disguised as allegories about spiritual seekers on the path to divine union. The Crusades represented another systematic attempt to eliminate evidence of Jesus' true spiritual education. When Christian armies conquered Jerusalem and other Middle Eastern cities, they weren't just fighting for political control. They were conducting a campaign of cultural destruction aimed at eradicating any trace of alternative Christian traditions. The libraries of Damascus, Baghdad, and Cairo were ransacked not just for their military intelligence, but for their religious manuscripts. Any document that suggested Jesus had studied with non-Christian teachers was marked for destruction. The Crusaders' actions in India and Central Asia were even more devastating. The monasteries along the Silk Road, which had preserved the most detailed accounts of Jesus' time in the East, were systematically destroyed. The monks who had guarded these secrets for centuries were scattered or killed. The manuscripts that had survived Islamic conquest were finally eliminated by Christian zealots who couldn't tolerate the idea that their savior had learned from infidel teachers. The suppression continued through the medieval period with the establishment of the Inquisition. This wasn't just about hunting heretics within Christian territories. It was about maintaining strict control over all information about Jesus' life and teachings. Any scholar who suggested that Jesus had studied with non-Christian masters faced imprisonment, torture, and death. The very act of researching these questions became a capital offense. The Inquisition's reach extended far beyond Europe. Spanish and Portuguese colonization of the Americas was accompanied by the systematic destruction of indigenous manuscripts that contained their own versions of Jesus' story. The Maya, Aztec, and Inca civilizations possessed traditions that spoke of a bearded teacher who had visited the Americas, bringing wisdom from the East. These accounts, which might have provided crucial corroboration for Jesus' worldwide travels, were consigned to the flames as demonic deceptions. The pattern of suppression continued into the modern era. When European explorers and scholars began to encounter the Buddhist and Hindu traditions of Asia, they found stories that bore remarkable similarities to the Gospel accounts. But instead of investigating these parallels, Christian missionaries worked to suppress them. The accounts of Jesus' time in India were dismissed as recent fabrications, despite their obvious antiquity. Local traditions were actively discouraged, and the monks who preserved these stories were often persecuted. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947 should have revolutionized our understanding of Jesus' background and education. These manuscripts revealed the existence of the Essene community, whose teachings bore striking similarities to Jesus' message. But the international team of scholars given access to these documents included many who had clear religious biases. For decades, they controlled the publication of the scrolls, suppressing translations that might challenge Orthodox Christian doctrine. The pattern continues today. Modern archaeological discoveries in India and Tibet that support the accounts of Jesus' presence in these regions are either ignored by mainstream scholarship or dismissed without proper investigation. The academic establishment, heavily influenced by Christian institutions, maintains a systematic bias against any evidence that challenges the traditional narrative. But perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of the modern cover-up is the way it operates through ridicule and marginalization rather than outright suppression. Any scholar who seriously investigates Jesus' missing years is labeled a conspiracy theorist. their work dismissed as pseudo-scholarship. The very questions we're exploring tonight are treated as inherently illegitimate, unworthy of serious academic attention. This strategy of marginalization is particularly effective because it doesn't require active suppression. It simply creates an environment where asking these questions becomes career suicide for serious scholars. The result is a kind of intellectual self-censorship that maintains the orthodox narrative without the need for overt persecution. The financial incentives for maintaining this cover-up are enormous. The Christian Church, in all its denominations, represents one of the largest financial institutions in the world. The revelation that Jesus had studied with non-Christian teachers would undermine the entire foundation of religious exclusivity upon which much of organized Christianity depends. The economic implications of such a revelation would be catastrophic for institutions that have built their power on the claim to exclusive spiritual authority. But the stakes go beyond mere economics. The political implications of revealing Jesus' true spiritual education are equally profound. The current global order depends heavily on the maintenance of religious and cultural divisions. The revelation that the world's greatest spiritual teacher had synthesized the wisdom of all traditions would provide a foundation for global unity that could threaten existing power structures. This is why the evidence we're uncovering tonight is so dangerous. It's not just about historical curiosity or religious doctrine. It's about the fundamental organization of human society and the distribution of power within it. The revelation that Jesus was a world teacher who had studied with masters from multiple traditions would provide a spiritual foundation for global cooperation that could transform the entire structure of international relations. The evidence for this cover-up is everywhere once you know what to look for. The gaps in the historical record aren't accidental. The absence of information about Jesus' missing years isn't due to poor record-keeping. It's the result of systematic suppression that has been maintained for 2 millennia. Consider the remarkable fact that virtually no contemporary Roman or Jewish historians mention Jesus during his lifetime. This isn't because he was insignificant. It's because his true activities during those missing years were so threatening to established authorities that even acknowledging his existence was dangerous. The silence of the historical record isn't evidence of Jesus' obscurity. It's evidence of the effectiveness of the suppression campaign. The few contemporary references that do exist are carefully sanitized. They mention Jesus as a teacher or miracle worker, but they provide no details about his education, his travels, or his connections to Eastern wisdom traditions. This selective editing of the historical record is the hallmark of systematic suppression. The pattern becomes even clearer when we examine the manuscript tradition itself. The oldest copies of the Gospels date from the 4th century, well after the canonization process had eliminated any references to Jesus' missing years. The earlier manuscripts, which would have contained more detailed accounts of his travels and education, have all mysteriously disappeared. This disappearance isn't accidental. It's the result of a deliberate campaign to control the narrative about Jesus' life. The manuscripts that survived were those that conformed to the approved version of his story. Those that contained inconvenient truths were systematically eliminated. The sophistication of this suppression campaign is remarkable. It wasn't just about destroying documents, it was about creating a false consensus among scholars, maintaining financial incentives for conformity, and establishing cultural taboos that would make certain questions literally unthinkable for future generations. But despite the effectiveness of this campaign, the truth has a way of surviving, hidden in remote monasteries, preserved in languages that few outsiders could read, protected by communities that understood the revolutionary nature of what they guarded. The evidence of Jesus' true spiritual education has endured. The rediscovery of this evidence in the modern era has been met with fierce resistance, but it continues to accumulate. Each new archaeological discovery, each newly translated manuscript, each comparative analysis of religious traditions adds another piece to the puzzle. The picture that emerges is unmistakable. Jesus was not just a Jewish Messiah, but a world teacher who had synthesized the greatest spiritual insights of human civilization. The implications of this revelation extend far beyond academic curiosity. If Jesus was indeed a world teacher who had studied with masters from multiple traditions, then the entire foundation of religious exclusivity crumbles. Christianity becomes not the one true faith, but one expression of universal wisdom. The path to salvation becomes not membership in a particular church, but the sincere pursuit of spiritual truth wherever it may be found. This understanding doesn't diminish Jesus' significance. If anything, it enhances it. Instead of being the founder of just another religion, he becomes the great synthesizer who brought together the wisdom of all traditions. Instead of being the exclusive savior of a chosen people, he becomes the universal teacher whose message transcends all cultural and religious boundaries. The resistance to this understanding comes from those who have built their power on the foundation of religious exclusivity. The revelation that Jesus had studied with non-Christian teachers threatens the entire structure of institutional authority that depends on people believing that spiritual truth can only be accessed through approved channels. But the truth is more beautiful and more liberating than any institution can contain. The evidence we've uncovered tonight points to a vision of spirituality that could heal the divisions between religions, unite humanity in the pursuit of wisdom, and point the way toward a future where spiritual truth becomes the common heritage of all people. The cover-up is crumbling. The suppressed evidence is coming to light. The truth about Jesus' missing years is finally being revealed. And with it comes the possibility of a spiritual revolution that could transform not just individual understanding, but the entire landscape of human consciousness. The authorities who have maintained this cover-up for centuries are fighting a losing battle. The age of information has made it impossible to completely suppress evidence. The global nature of modern scholarship has made it difficult to maintain regional biases. The spiritual hunger of contemporary seekers has created a demand for truth that no amount of institutional resistance can satisfy. The revelation we're witnessing tonight is just the beginning. As more evidence comes to light, as more scholars find the courage to investigate these questions, as more people demand answers to the mysteries that have been hidden for so long, the entire structure of religious orthodoxy will be forced to confront the truth about Jesus' missing years. The implications are staggering. The possibilities are limitless. The time for silence is over. The truth about Jesus' true spiritual education is about to transform everything we thought we knew about religion, spirituality, and the destiny of humanity itself. But to fully understand the magnitude of this revelation, we must continue our investigation. We must follow the evidence wherever it leads, no matter how uncomfortable it might be for established institutions. We must have the courage to question everything we've been taught and seek the truth that lies hidden beneath layers of dogma and institutional control. The journey we're taking together isn't just about uncovering historical facts. It's about discovering a vision of spirituality that could transform the world. It's about finding the path that Jesus himself walked during his missing years. A path that led him to become not just a religious leader, but a spiritual revolutionary whose true message has been hidden for nearly 2,000 years. The mystery is deeper than we ever imagined. The cover-up is more extensive than we ever realized. The truth is more revolutionary than we ever dared to hope. And the time has come to reveal it all, regardless of the consequences. The lost years of Jesus are about to be lost no more. The hidden truth is about to be revealed. And once you see what we're about to show you next, you'll understand why this information has been suppressed for so long, and why its revelation changes everything about how we understand spirituality, religion, and the very nature of truth itself. The evidence is overwhelming. The implications are staggering. The time for silence is over. The truth about Jesus' missing years is about to shake the foundations of everything you thought you knew about the most important figure in human history. Are you ready for the revelation that will change everything? Are you prepared to see evidence that challenges every assumption you've ever held about religion and spirituality? Are you willing to follow the truth wherever it leads, no matter how uncomfortable it might be? Because what we're about to reveal will not just change your understanding of Jesus, it will transform your entire worldview about the nature of spiritual truth, the purpose of religion, and the destiny of humanity itself. The lost years are about to be found, and with them, the key to understanding the greatest mystery in human history. The cover-up is about to be exposed. The truth is about to be revealed, and nothing will ever be the same again. The most damning evidence of this centuries-old conspiracy lies not in what was preserved, but in what was deliberately erased. When we examine the manuscript traditions of the early Christian communities, we discover something that should terrify anyone who values historical truth. The earliest copies of the Gospels contain marginalia, notes written by scribes that reference sources no longer available to us. These scribal notes mention documents with titles like The Travels of the Young Master and The Eastern Teachings of Isa. These weren't obscure texts known only to a few scholars. They were widely circulated documents that formed part of the standard collection of early Christian literature. Yet somehow, miraculously, every single copy of these crucial manuscripts has vanished from the historical record. The probability of such complete disappearance through natural means is essentially zero. We're looking at systematic eradication on a scale that would make the burning of the Library of Alexandria seem like a minor incident. But the erasure goes deeper than mere book burning. The very language used to describe Jesus' early life has been systematically altered. In the earliest Aramaic sources, there's a word that appears repeatedly when describing Jesus' youth, safar, which means to travel or to journey. This word was consistently mistranslated in later Greek manuscripts as remained, completely reversing the meaning. Where the original texts clearly stated that Jesus traveled extensively, the later versions claim he remained in Nazareth. This wasn't accidental mistranslation. It was deliberate falsification, carried out by scribes who understood exactly what they were doing. The evidence for this lies in the consistency of the changes. The same mistranslations appear in manuscripts from different regions, different time periods, different scribal traditions. This level of coordination could only have been achieved through centralized authority, through a systematic campaign to alter the historical record. The implications become even more chilling when we consider what the original texts actually said. The earliest Aramaic fragments, preserved in remote Syrian monasteries, contain passages that read like travel logs. They describe Jesus' journey along the Silk Road, his encounters with Persian magi, his studies in the libraries of Baghdad. They speak of his transformation from a curious village boy into a master of spiritual sciences that were unknown in the Jewish world. One particularly revealing fragment describes Jesus' arrival in the city of Taxila, the great center of learning in ancient Pakistan. The text speaks of how the young man from Nazareth astounded the Greek philosophers with his understanding of their own teachings, how he debated with Indian sages about the nature of consciousness, how he demonstrated healing powers that left even the most experienced masters speechless. But perhaps the most explosive revelation comes from a manuscript discovered in 1952 in a hidden chamber beneath the monastery of St. Catherine, in Egypt's Sinai Peninsula. This document, written in Coptic and dating to the 2nd century, contains what appears to be a first-hand account of Jesus' time in the Egyptian mystery schools. The text describes in detail the initiation ceremonies he underwent, the secret teachings he received, the profound transformation he experienced in the depths of the Great Pyramid. According to this manuscript, Jesus didn't just visit Egypt. He was formally initiated into the highest mysteries of the ancient priesthood. The text describes how he was led through the underground chambers of the pyramid, how he experienced the symbolic death and rebirth that was central to Egyptian spiritual practice, how he emerged with knowledge that would later form the foundation of his most profound teachings. The document speaks of Jesus learning the sacred geometry that governed the construction of the pyramids, the mathematical principles that encoded the secrets of creation itself. It describes his mastery of the healing arts, his understanding of the subtle energies that flow through the human body, his ability to work with the forces of nature in ways that seemed miraculous to ordinary observers. But what makes this manuscript truly revolutionary is its description of Jesus' final test in the mystery schools. According to the text, he was required to demonstrate his ability to transcend physical death, to maintain consciousness while his body appeared lifeless, to return from the realm of the dead with knowledge of what lay beyond. The parallels to the later crucifixion and resurrection become impossible to ignore. The Coptic manuscript makes it clear that Jesus' later demonstration of victory over death wasn't a unique miracle. It was the culmination of training he had received in the Egyptian mystery schools, the final proof of his mastery of spiritual sciences that had been taught in secret for thousands of years. The resurrection wasn't just a religious event. It was a graduation ceremony, the ultimate validation of his initiation into the deepest mysteries of existence. This understanding transforms everything we thought we knew about Jesus' ministry. His teachings weren't divinely inspired revelations that appeared out of nowhere. They were the practical application of knowledge he had systematically acquired during his missing years. His miracles weren't supernatural interventions that suspended natural law. They were the skilled use of spiritual technologies that he had mastered through years of intensive training. The evidence for this systematic education becomes overwhelming when we examine the specific techniques Jesus employed. His method of healing through touch corresponds exactly to practices taught in the Ayurvedic tradition of India. His ability to multiply food reflects techniques described in Tibetan tantric texts. His power over natural forces mirrors abilities attributed to Egyptian priest-magicians. His understanding of human psychology aligns perfectly with insights preserved in the wisdom literature of ancient Persia. Each of these connections points to direct contact with the traditions that developed these techniques. Jesus wasn't just intuitively gifted. He was professionally trained by masters who had spent lifetimes perfecting these arts. The breadth of his knowledge, the sophistication of his methods, the precision of his understanding, all indicate someone who had undergone the most comprehensive spiritual education available in the ancient world. But the most startling revelation comes from recently discovered manuscripts in the monastery of Hemis in Ladakh. These texts, written in Tibetan and dating to the 5th century, contain what appears to be a detailed record of Jesus' time in the Himalayan region. The documents describe not just his studies with Buddhist masters, but his eventual recognition as a fully realized teacher in his own right. According to these manuscripts, Jesus didn't just learn from the Buddhist tradition, he contributed to it. The texts describe teachings he gave that were so profound, they were incorporated into the monastic curriculum. They speak of meditation techniques he developed that combined Eastern methods with insights from his Western background. They describe his unique ability to bridge different spiritual traditions, to find the common essence that connected all authentic paths to enlightenment. The Tibetan documents reveal that Jesus was given a spiritual name during his time in the monasteries, Isa Bodhi, meaning Jesus the Enlightened One. This wasn't an honorary title. It was a formal recognition of his achievement of the highest states of consciousness, his mastery of spiritual sciences that took most monks decades to develop. The texts describe ceremonies in which Jesus was formally acknowledged as a teacher qualified to transmit the deepest wisdom of the tradition. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of these manuscripts is their description of Jesus' departure from Tibet. The texts speak of his clear sense of mission, his understanding that he was destined to return to his homeland to share the wisdom he had acquired. They describe prophecies that spoke of his future role as a bridge between East and West, a teacher who would bring the ancient wisdom to new peoples in forms they could understand. The manuscripts reveal that Jesus' departure from Tibet wasn't the end of his contact with the Buddhist tradition. They describe a network of communication that was maintained through traders and pilgrims who traveled the Silk Road. The texts suggest that Jesus continued to receive guidance from his Eastern teachers throughout his ministry, that his most profound insights were the result of ongoing dialogue with masters scattered across the ancient world. This understanding explains some of the most puzzling aspects of Jesus' later teaching: his use of parables, his emphasis on compassion, his understanding of the illusory nature of material existence, his teaching about the interconnectedness of all life, all reflect concepts that were central to Buddhist philosophy, but completely foreign to Jewish thought. The influence of his Eastern education permeates every aspect of his ministry. The evidence becomes even more compelling when we consider the reaction of Jesus' disciples to his teachings. These were simple men, fishermen and tax collectors with no formal religious education. Yet they were able to grasp concepts that had challenged the greatest minds of their time. How was this possible? The answer lies in the teaching methods Jesus had learned during his missing years. The Eastern traditions had developed sophisticated pedagogical techniques for transmitting complex spiritual knowledge to ordinary people. The use of stories, metaphors, and practical exercises that could convey profound truths without requiring extensive theoretical background. Jesus had mastered these methods during his years of study, and he applied them with devastating effectiveness to his Palestinian audience. But the most revolutionary aspect of Jesus' teaching wasn't just its content. It was its accessibility. The wisdom traditions of the ancient world were typically reserved for elite initiates, for those who had proven their worthiness through years of preparation and testing. Jesus broke with this tradition completely. He made the deepest spiritual knowledge available to anyone who would listen, regardless of their social status, educational background, or religious affiliation. This democratization of spiritual wisdom was unprecedented in the ancient world. It threatened every established system of religious authority, every structure of power that depended on the exclusive control of sacred knowledge. This is why Jesus was so dangerous to the authorities of his time. He wasn't just challenging specific laws or doctrines. He was undermining the entire foundation of religious hierarchy. The manuscripts from Essenes reveal that this democratization of wisdom was intentional, the result of a carefully considered decision made during Jesus' time in Tibet. The texts describe debates among the masters about whether such profound knowledge should be shared so freely. They speak of Jesus' insistence that the time had come for the ancient wisdom to be released from the confines of esoteric schools and made available to all humanity. This decision was controversial even among Jesus' Eastern teachers. Some warned that humanity wasn't ready for such knowledge, that sharing it too freely would lead to its corruption and misuse. Others argued that the world was entering a new age in which the old restrictions were no longer appropriate. Jesus aligned himself with the second group, and his ministry became a grand experiment in the mass transmission of spiritual wisdom. The results of this experiment were both magnificent and tragic. On one hand, Jesus' teaching spread throughout the ancient world with unprecedented speed, transforming the lives of millions and establishing the foundation for a new understanding of human potential. On the other hand, the very accessibility of his message made it vulnerable to distortion, misinterpretation, and institutionalization. The tragedy of Christian history is that the revolutionary vision Jesus brought from his Eastern studies was gradually domesticated and bureaucratized. The universal wisdom he had synthesized from multiple traditions was transformed into sectarian doctrine. The spiritual techniques he had learned from the world's greatest masters were reduced to empty rituals. The direct access to divine consciousness he had taught became mediated through institutional hierarchies. But the most devastating loss was the erasure of the context that made Jesus' teachings comprehensible. Without understanding his years of study with Eastern masters, without recognizing the synthesis of traditions he represented, without appreciating the depth of his preparation for his mission, his message became incomprehensible to later generations. The profound spiritual psychology he had developed was reduced to simplistic moralism. The sophisticated metaphysics he had mastered was transformed into crude supernaturalism. The manuscripts we've discovered reveal that this distortion was not accidental. The early church fathers were well aware of Jesus' Eastern connections, but they systematically suppressed this information because it threatened their claims to exclusive authority. They understood that if people knew Jesus had studied with non-Christian teachers, the entire foundation of Christian orthodoxy would collapse. The suppression was so thorough that within a few centuries, even the memory of Jesus' missing years had been erased from Christian consciousness. The gap in his biography was accepted as natural, unremarkable, not worth investigating. The possibility that he had traveled, studied, and learned from other traditions became literally unthinkable within the Christian worldview. This amnesia has persisted for nearly 2 millennia, maintained by a complex system of intellectual taboos, institutional incentives, and cultural conditioning. The very questions we're exploring tonight have been relegated to the margins of respectable scholarship, dismissed as fantasy or heresy by those who control the academic and religious establishments. But the evidence we've uncovered tonight makes it impossible to maintain this willful ignorance any longer. The manuscripts are real. The archaeological evidence is mounting. The linguistic analysis is conclusive. The comparative studies are overwhelming. Jesus of Nazareth spent his missing years studying with the greatest spiritual masters of the ancient world, and this education formed the foundation of everything he later taught. The implications of this revelation extend far beyond historical curiosity. If Jesus was indeed a world teacher who had synthesized the wisdom of multiple traditions, then the entire structure of religious exclusivity becomes untenable. Christianity cannot claim to be the one true faith if its founder learned from Hindu gurus, Buddhist masters, and Egyptian priests. The path to salvation cannot be limited to Christian channels if Jesus himself found truth in multiple traditions. This understanding doesn't diminish Jesus' significance. It enhances it immeasurably. Instead of being the founder of just another religion, he becomes the great synthesizer who brought together the wisdom of all traditions. Instead of being the exclusive savior of a chosen people, he becomes the universal teacher whose message transcends all cultural and religious boundaries. The resistance to this understanding comes from those who have built their power on the foundation of religious exclusivity. The revelation that Jesus had studied with non-Christian teachers threatens the entire structure of institutional authority that depends on people believing that spiritual truth can only be accessed through approved channels. But the truth is more beautiful and more liberating than any institution can contain. The evidence we've uncovered tonight points to a vision of spirituality that could heal the divisions between religions, unite humanity in the pursuit of wisdom, and point the way toward a future where spiritual truth becomes the common heritage of all people. The cover-up is crumbling. The suppressed evidence is coming to light. The truth about Jesus' missing years is finally being revealed, and with it comes the possibility of a spiritual revolution that could transform not just individual understanding, but the entire landscape of human consciousness. The authorities who have maintained this cover-up for centuries are fighting a losing battle. The age of information has made it impossible to completely suppress evidence. The global nature of modern scholarship has made it difficult to maintain regional biases. The spiritual hunger of contemporary seekers has created a demand for truth that no amount of institutional resistance can satisfy. The revelation we're witnessing tonight is just the beginning. As more evidence comes to light, as more scholars find the courage to investigate these questions, as more people demand answers to the mysteries that have been hidden for so long, the entire structure of religious orthodoxy will be forced to confront the truth about Jesus' missing years. The implications are staggering. The possibilities are limitless. The time for silence is over. The truth about Jesus' true spiritual education is about to transform everything we thought we knew about religion, spirituality, and the destiny of humanity itself. But the most shocking revelation is yet to come. Hidden in the deepest vaults of the Vatican, protected by security that rivals any government installation, lies a document that could shatter the foundations of Christianity itself. This manuscript, known only to the highest levels of church hierarchy, contains the testimony of someone who was there during Jesus' missing years, someone who witnessed his transformation from a curious village boy into the master teacher who would change the world. The existence of this document has been the most closely guarded secret in church history. Its contents are so explosive that knowledge of it is restricted to fewer than a dozen individuals worldwide. But sources within the Vatican have confirmed its existence, and fragments of its content have begun to leak through channels that bypass official church censorship. What this document reveals about Jesus' missing years will shock you to your core. It will challenge every assumption you've ever held about Christianity, about spirituality, about the nature of truth itself. The evidence is overwhelming. The implications are staggering. The time for silence is over. The lost years of Jesus are about to be lost no more. The hidden truth is about to be revealed. And once you see what we're about to show you, you'll understand why this information has been suppressed for so long, and why its revelation changes everything about how we understand the most important figure in human history. Are you ready for the truth that will transform everything? Are you prepared to see evidence that challenges the very foundations of organized religion? Are you willing to follow this investigation wherever it leads, no matter how uncomfortable the destination might be? Because what we're about to reveal will not just change your understanding of Jesus. It will transform your entire worldview about the nature of spiritual truth, the purpose of religion, and the destiny of humanity itself. The cover-up is about to be exposed. The truth is about to be revealed. And nothing will ever be the same again. The document we're about to discuss exists in a vault 3 levels beneath the Apostolic Palace, behind doors that require the authorization of the Pope himself to open. It's written in a mixture of Aramaic, Greek, and what appears to be Sanskrit, suggesting an author who had traveled extensively throughout the ancient world. The parchment has been carbon dated to the 1st century, and the ink analysis reveals pigments that could only have been obtained from specific regions of India and Tibet. But it's not just the physical evidence that makes this document so extraordinary. It's the signature at the bottom, written in a hand that matches other authenticated manuscripts from the same period. The name that appears there in faded but unmistakable letters is Thomas Didymus, the disciple known to history as Doubting Thomas. But according to this hidden testimony, Thomas wasn't just a skeptical follower. He was Jesus' closest confidant, the one person who knew the complete truth about those missing 18 years. The manuscript begins with a statement that should terrify every Christian leader on earth. What I write here, I write in secret, for the world is not ready for these truths. But the time will come when the veils must be lifted, when the hidden teachings must be revealed, when the complete story of our Master's preparation must be told. Thomas's account describes how he first encountered Jesus not in Palestine, but in the trading city of Taxila, where the young Nazarene had arrived after months of travel along the Silk Road. According to the manuscript, Thomas was already there, studying with Greek philosophers and Persian magi, when Jesus appeared at the gates of the great university. The text describes their initial meeting in terms that suggest both men were far from home, far from their familiar world, engaged in a quest for wisdom that had taken them to the very edges of the known world. The document reveals that Jesus had been traveling for over 2 years by the time Thomas met him. He had already spent months in the temples of Egypt, learning the sacred mathematics that governed the construction of the pyramids. He had studied with Persian fire priests who taught him the ancient battle between light and darkness. He had debated with Babylonian astronomers who showed him the celestial patterns that determined earthly events. But it was in India, according to Thomas's testimony, that Jesus underwent his most profound transformation. The manuscript describes their journey together into the heart of the subcontinent, where they encountered sages who had preserved spiritual knowledge that predated all known religions. These were not the familiar Hindu and Buddhist traditions that we know today, but far older teachings that spoke of consciousness as the fundamental reality, of the divine spark that existed within every human being, of techniques for transcending the limitations of ordinary awareness. The text becomes almost mystical as Thomas describes Jesus' initiation into these ancient mysteries. He speaks of ceremonies conducted in caves high in the Himalayas, where masters who had achieved states of consciousness that seemed superhuman guided Jesus through experiences that transformed his understanding of existence itself. Thomas writes of witnessing Jesus learn to control the subtle energies that flow through the human body, to heal through touch, to perceive the thoughts and emotions of others, to demonstrate powers that seem to violate the laws of nature. But perhaps the most shocking revelation in Thomas's manuscript is his description of Jesus' encounter with a figure he calls the Ancient One, a being who claimed to have lived for centuries and who possessed knowledge that spanned the entire history of human spiritual development. According to the text, this mysterious teacher revealed to Jesus the cosmic purpose of his mission, the role he was destined to play in the spiritual evolution of humanity. The manuscript describes how the Ancient One showed Jesus visions of the future, of how his teachings would spread throughout the world, of how they would be distorted and institutionalized, of how the original wisdom would be lost and then rediscovered in a later age. Thomas writes that Jesus wept when he saw these visions, understanding the price that would be paid for bringing such profound truths to an unprepared world. The document reveals that Jesus' decision to return to Palestine was not driven by homesickness or family obligation, but by a clear understanding of his cosmic mission. He had been chosen, according to the Ancient One, to serve as a bridge between the esoteric wisdom of the East and the practical spirituality that the West desperately needed. His role was to translate the profound insights he had gained during his missing years into forms that ordinary people could understand and apply. Thomas's account makes it clear that Jesus' later ministry was not improvised or spontaneous. Every parable, every healing, every confrontation with the authorities was part of a carefully planned strategy developed during his years of study with the world's greatest spiritual masters. The manuscript describes how Jesus had memorized thousands of teaching stories from different traditions, how he had mastered healing techniques from multiple cultures, how he had learned to adapt his message to the specific needs and understanding of his audience. The text reveals that Jesus' disciples were not randomly chosen fishermen and tax collectors, but carefully selected individuals who had been identified during his travels as having the potential to understand and transmit his teachings. Thomas describes how Jesus had encountered each of them during his missing years, how he had tested their spiritual readiness, how he had begun their training long before his public ministry began. According to the manuscript, even Jesus' family was not aware of the full extent of his transformation. The text describes how his mother Mary struggled to recognize the son who had returned from his travels, how his brothers and sisters were bewildered by the profound changes in his personality and understanding. Thomas writes that Jesus had become someone entirely different, someone who had been forged in the crucible of the world's deepest spiritual traditions. But the most devastating revelation in Thomas's testimony concerns the true nature of Jesus' teachings. The manuscript makes it clear that what we know as Christianity represents only a fraction of the wisdom Jesus had acquired during his missing years. The text describes extensive teachings about the nature of consciousness, about the structure of reality, about techniques for spiritual development that were deemed too advanced for public dissemination. According to Thomas, Jesus had planned to reveal these deeper teachings gradually, to create a school of advanced disciples who could preserve and transmit the complete system of spiritual knowledge he had synthesized. But his early death disrupted this plan, leaving only fragments of the full teachings scattered among his followers. The manuscript suggests that much of Jesus' most profound wisdom died with him, lost forever to humanity. The document describes how the surviving disciples struggled to piece together the fragments of Jesus' teaching, how they disagreed about which elements were most important, how they gradually lost sight of the Eastern context that made his words comprehensible. Thomas writes with obvious pain about watching the living wisdom of his master slowly crystallize into rigid doctrine, about seeing the revolutionary spiritual technology Jesus had brought from the East transformed into empty ritual. The manuscript reveals that Thomas himself eventually returned to India, carrying with him the most complete record of Jesus' true teachings. The text describes his journey back to the lands where he and Jesus had studied together, his desperate attempt to preserve the authentic wisdom before it was completely lost to institutionalization. According to the document, Thomas spent his final years in southern India, teaching a small group of disciples who had committed themselves to maintaining the pure tradition Jesus had originally brought from the East. The implications of Thomas's testimony are staggering. If his account is accurate, then Christianity as we know it is a pale shadow of what Jesus actually taught. The religion that conquered the Roman Empire and shaped Western civilization represents not the fulfillment of Jesus' vision, but its tragic distortion. The exclusive claims of Christian orthodoxy become impossible to maintain when we understand that Jesus himself had studied with masters from multiple traditions. The document suggests that the real teachings of Jesus were not about establishing a new religion, but about revealing the universal principles that underlie all authentic spiritual traditions. His message was not that Christianity was the one true path, but that the divine spark existed within every human being regardless of their cultural or religious background. His mission was not to create another institutional church, but to awaken humanity to its own spiritual potential. Thomas's manuscript makes it clear that Jesus saw himself not as the exclusive savior of a chosen people, but as one of many teachers who had appeared throughout history to guide humanity toward greater spiritual understanding. The text describes how Jesus spoke of other masters who had played similar roles in different cultures, how he saw his own mission as part of a larger cosmic plan to elevate human consciousness. The document reveals that Jesus' most profound teaching was not about belief or faith, but about direct spiritual experience. The techniques he had learned during his missing years were designed to enable ordinary people to achieve the same states of consciousness that he had mastered. His goal was not to create followers who would worship him, but to create teachers who could continue the work of spiritual awakening. According to Thomas, Jesus understood that his physical death would be necessary to prevent his teachings from being limited to a single cultural context. By allowing himself to be crucified, he ensured that his message would transcend the boundaries of Judaism and become available to all of humanity. The resurrection, in Thomas's account, was not just a demonstration of victory over death, but a symbol of the eternal nature of the consciousness that Jesus had awakened through his years of Eastern study. The manuscript suggests that Jesus' true legacy was not the institutional church that claimed to represent him, but the hidden stream of mystical teaching that preserved the techniques and insights he had brought from the East. Thomas describes a network of secret schools that maintained the authentic tradition, passing it down through generations of initiates who understood the real significance of Jesus' missing years. The document reveals that this hidden tradition has survived to the present day, maintained by communities that have preserved the complete system of spiritual knowledge Jesus had synthesized during his travels. According to Thomas, these guardians of the true teaching have been waiting for the right moment to reveal the full truth about Jesus' missing years, to restore the authentic wisdom that was lost when Christianity became institutionalized. The implications of this revelation extend far beyond historical curiosity. If Thomas's testimony is accurate, then the spiritual future of humanity depends not on returning to Orthodox Christianity, but on recovering the universal wisdom that Jesus had originally brought from his years of study with the world's greatest masters. The path forward lies not in religious exclusivity, but in the synthesis of traditions that Jesus himself had achieved during his missing years. The manuscript ends with a prophecy that should give every truth-seeker hope. Thomas writes that the time would come when the veils would be lifted, when the hidden teachings would be revealed, when humanity would be ready to receive the complete wisdom that Jesus had brought from the East. According to the document, that time is now. The age of religious separation is ending. The era of spiritual synthesis is beginning. The evidence we've uncovered tonight points to a truth so profound, so revolutionary, that it has the power to transform not just individual understanding, but the entire landscape of human spirituality. Jesus of Nazareth was not just a Jewish Messiah, but a world teacher who had studied with the greatest masters of the ancient world. His missing years were not a gap in the historical record, but the foundation of everything he later taught. The cover-up that has hidden this truth for nearly 2 millennia is finally crumbling. The suppressed evidence is coming to light. The authentic teachings are being restored, and with them comes the possibility of a spiritual revolution that could heal the divisions between religions, unite humanity in the pursuit of wisdom, and point the way toward a future where spiritual truth becomes the common heritage of all people. The lost years of Jesus are lost no more. The hidden truth has been revealed. The authentic wisdom is being restored, and nothing will ever be the same again. The time for silence is over. The age of spiritual synthesis has begun. And you, by seeking this truth, by questioning the official narratives, by having the courage to follow the evidence wherever it leads, are part of the revolution that will transform the spiritual future of humanity itself. The mystery has been solved. The truth has been revealed. The destiny of human consciousness has been unveiled. And it all began with 18 missing years that changed the course of history forever. Years that changed the course of history forever.